Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please hit that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate a small amount given in the link in the description box. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest tonight, Professor Radhika Desai. Professor Desai is a professor at University of Manitoba and is also the director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group. Professor Desai, welcome back to India and Global Left. It has been a while.
It has been, and it's always a great pleasure to come back and talk to you, Jyotishman. It's wonderful. Thank you. Always have an interesting conversation with you.
Thank you. I thought the war, the US-Iran war, is something that we should really begin with, given it is historic in so many ways. A strategic defeat of the superpower by a country whose economic ranking would be among 24th and 25th. And certainly from West Asia's perspective, when the US used to have a good time, at least on its entry in Iraq, in Afghanistan, where there was not much of fighting just to begin with, got a bloody nose. And I was curious to hear your thoughts about what is the larger impact of Iran's strategic victory over the US for Western imperialism.
Well, I would say that that the outcome of this war, which was entirely a war of choice on the part of Trump, has been to accelerate the decline of imperialism quite significantly. I mean, and I should also put that in a bit of a context. I should say that in my view, the way I look at it, imperialism has been declining since at least 1914, since the outbreak of the First World War and the larger 30 years crisis of capitalism and imperialism. It hasn't been declining as fast as you and I would like it to, but it has been declining. The options of the imperialist countries have been progressively narrowing. Decolonization was part of it. With the beginning of the neoliberal period, it looked momentarily as if imperialism had come back recharged, imposing structural adjustment all over the world and, squeezing third world countries through their, thanks to their debtor status and so on. But I would say that this period, nasty though it was, did not last very long. And by the new century, a whole new reality was becoming clear. And particularly, although the Soviet Union, of course, ceased to exist, the development of China took center stage. And also BRICS became a very important topic of discussion. So all of that was part of the decline. But I would say that when I think of the decline of imperialism, I think of at least two different aspects. So that is one aspect, that is to say the development of new countries and very reasonable development of new countries, particularly China. Of course, China leaves everybody else back in the dust. But this is not to discount the very real gains that have been made in countries like Brazil or Mexico or India or what have you. I mean, so that's one set of things. And the other set of things is, of course, the deterioration of capitalism, the productive decline, the financialization, the rise in inequality, the exacerbation of the demand problem, all of these things, you put it together, and Western capitalism is not doing very well at all. So these two things combine to bring us to the current conjuncture of declining imperialism. And I would say that maybe one final point. You see, Engels says in his The Role of Force in History that you cannot fight a war without having an industrial base. This point also comes through in that wonderful novel and film, Gone with the Wind, which is about the American Civil War. And in it, the large part of the reason the South loses is because the South does not have industry. The North has industry. So I think the deindustrialization of Western countries, of the North Atlantic region, is telling on its capacity to produce weapons. This was already clear in a report that came out very early on in the Ukraine war. It was a report from the Royal United Services Institute, which is based here in London, which basically said that, the West is not going to be able to produce weapons at the rate that Ukraine will need. And we saw, of course, in the case of the Iran war, the US had to divert munitions and weapon systems from their deployment elsewhere to fight this Iran war. So they are not in a position to fight it. So that's one. And then there's a broader sense in which it's part of the decline of imperialism. But I'll finish here for now.
Yeah, I was curious to hear your thoughts on you mentioned rise of BRICS, and you said that, of course, the rise of China is the most spectacular of all, but there are others, Brazil, India, and others. I was curious to hear your thoughts about how do you conceptualize the rise of the global south? I mean, on one hand, is falling share of GDP of the West, and so there you see a clear rise of the global south. But in terms of ideology, it seems to be really very unstable. I mean, with the recent spate of developments in Latin America, Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, now Colombia, Ecuador, having all spate of right-wing, movements rising, and even in countries like India. So, is it? In what ways is it different from the old Cold War phase, where there used to be the Soviet allied group, the Western allied group, and then there were non-allied countries? Is it any different now? Have countries started to now really talk in terms of its sovereignty and autonomy and maintain equidistance from both blocs, if at all China is trying to form a bloc? I'm not sure if they are. But what is this global south? Is this defined just in terms of rise of share of GDP, or is there an ideology or politics embedded within them?
Yeah, so first of all, let me declare, just because I say this whenever I get the opportunity to, that I'm very allergic to the term global south. I don't think it's a very felicitous term. I prefer third world. Third world is rejected by people who think the third world means third class, that it's a pejorative term, but it isn't. Third world was a name, label that the third world countries themselves chose for themselves, because they said that, we are not capitalist, we are not communist, we represent a third way forward, we are the third world. That was the general idea. Now, having said that, I would also say that this idea, which is of course connected with non-alignment, to which you were just referring, it could never be completely non-aligned for a very simple reason. All developing countries were objectively aligned, or objectively they lean closer to the left, to the Soviet Union, etc., for the very simple reason that the development of the imperialist countries, of the big capitalist countries, of the homelands of capitalism, would never be a model for the third world countries, for a very simple reason. These countries had developed as a direct result of imperialism. They had benefited from imperialism. They had there is, for third world countries of today, there is no room to be imperialist. Lenin was right when he said that by the eve of the First World War, the whole world was divided up among the major capitalist powers, and there was nothing more left to colonize, to subordinate. And now, he said, you could only witness a war of redivision of this world. And indeed, that is what the First World War was. So the third world countries had to develop without imperialism. They had to develop against imperialist resistance. They had to develop from a point to which they had been sunk by imperialism, a lower point than the starting point of the first world countries. And they had to develop without the luxury of being able to export their surplus populations to allegedly empty continents. In all of these ways. So in that sense, the development of the Soviet Union, and people forget how spectacular it was in its own way. People forget that by the 1930s, the Soviet Union had become the second ranking industrial power in the world. This, that it was possible for the Soviet Union to do that. China is today a shining example of development, etc. So these countries have been able to succeed the most because development in these circumstances, with all these 4 points that I mentioned of contrast, it requires an enormous political will and political capacity. And it is not a surprise that the revolutionary societies like China or the Soviet Union have been able to muster that political capacity elsewhere. And you asked me about the rest of the BRICS. Elsewhere, there has been, in India, we had a developmental phase, in the immediate aftermath of independence that had substantial successes. It did give India a relatively broad industrial base, which had been absent and which not many third world countries can boast of. Similarly, you had developmental phases in places like Brazil or Mexico, where have you, Latin America, and so on. And there was this did happen, but of course, in the absence of a socialist party being in control, these developments were invariably prey to developing, or invariably they ended up developing powerful capitalist interests, which then have diverted development in more neoliberal directions. And so, I've written a lot about the BRICS. And one of the things I've always said is that the BRICS countries, what unites the BRICS countries is that their path to real development that benefits broad sections of the population, can only be in a non or anti-neoliberal ways. So, insofar as these countries like India or Brazil have, and Russia for that matter, have modified or rejected neoliberalism, they have developed. Where they are unable to do so, and when they are unable to do so, their development lags. This is a classic situation. You see that India's development has lagged since Modi came to power, whereas in the previous decade, precisely because the electoral outcome was such that a Congress otherwise inclined to neoliberalism was forced to compromise with left forces and, have this MNREGA and other, related programs that were able to expand domestic consumption power. India did have a decent economic record, but since the Modi government has come to power, it has not. Similarly, you saw a similar situation in Bolsonaro's when Bolsonaro was president of Brazil. So the other countries have gone back and forth, and I would say that especially now. Lula is back in power now, and that's very good. But of course, even Lula has his options restricted by the very, very substantial social power and political power of the Brazilian corporate bourgeoisie that are very inclined to lean towards the United States. So I would say that given that such governments are in power, particularly in New Delhi, Brasilia, etc., it seems as though the BRICS are sort of becoming less cohesive and so on. Meanwhile, there's a new acronym doing the rounds. You may have heard of it. It's called CRINC. And that refers to China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And these are all, at least they have been, they are or have been revolutionary societies. I put the have been because, of course, Russia is no longer the Soviet Union. But nevertheless, in some substantial way, the legacy of the Soviet Union remains part of Russia's attitude towards the world, particularly in its foreign policy. So these are perhaps more resolute developers. And certainly, I think Iran has shown an impressive amount of organizational, military, and even industrial capacity, which is in the course of the last war, which is truly admirable.
I have been reading and hearing from quite a few people, but mostly people who look at international relations, foreign affairs, strategic studies, that we are entering a phase of post-ideology. And, the examples cited are that Saudi Arabia has become much less ideological than it used to be. I mean, examples given are it's, sort of mixed relationship with the United States, looking eastward, a security pact with Pakistan, through Pakistan coming closer to China, and now really it's greater. Opening or outreach towards Iran, and even Iran has responded to in this war. We've seen that they have been much more reluctant to attack Saudi Arabia, even if they have had to do so under certain circumstance, and even that has been now said of Iran to some extent, that the society has become less ideological. Even though I'm not sure how much of that is applicable to Iran, but overall there is this framing coming from some people that right now, if you are a country from the global south, the best way to approach it is your self-interest, maintain good relationship with everyone you can, and act accordingly. Don't get into trouble, don't fight, and that is not entirely wrong, but that raises the question in my mind about what's the role of value here? What is ideology? What is politics? And how do we look at empire and imperialism? Because these are things that cannot be evaluated through a lens of balance or, non-ideological. So I'm curious what your response to the analysis that says that we are increasingly moving towards a world that is less and less ideological in foreign relations.
I'm rather skeptical of that. I mean, there is one sense in which it may be true and it may be positive, but there are many senses in which it is obviously wrong. I think what we are looking at is a world in which socialism as an ideology is definitely on the back foot. And I think that that is a big minus for the world as a whole. I think if socialist ideologies were alive today, were more vigorous today, then they would recognize the point we are at, recognize that capitalism is failing, and seize the political opportunities that that represents to set the world and different countries of the world on a path away from capitalism towards some kind of socialism, no matter how inventive, no matter how new and so on, but some path to socialism. And I think that insofar as the world has become non-ideological, it's because of this absence of socialism, and that's no good thing. Because as Rosa Luxemburg said, I mean, look, we are living in an increasingly barbaric world, whether you look at what's happening domestically in countries, or whether we look at the plane of international affairs. Across the board, we are seeing more and more repression, war, violence, etc., and of course, deprivation. And I think some kind of socialism is crying out. I mean, the need for it is crying. However, the right is tremendously ideological. The right is on the resurgent. I mean, here in Britain, I mean, so we have just seen the fall of Keir Starmer, whom Tariq Ali, I was about to say Steer Karma, whom Tariq Ali made this joke many years ago when Keir Starmer became leader of the Labour Party, and I'm now stumbling over it, steer karma. But of course, Keir Starmer was not able to steer karma. In fact, he's out on his bum, and now going to get a new prime minister. And all of this is because ultimately, of the fact that there is a deep, and Britain, like other advanced industrial countries, Britain and the United States here are very similar. They are undergoing a profound crisis, economic crisis, political crisis, social crisis of every sort possible. In the context of this crisis, precisely because the left is not present, and when it was present briefly in the form of the Corbynite Labour Party, it was hounded out of existence by the powers that be, using every underhand method possible, including accusing Jeremy Corbyn of being an anti-Semite, blah, blah, etc. So all of this stuff happened. And so given that, what you got was the research, all the discontents of neoliberalism were mobilized by the right, first by Boris Johnson and his irresponsible, reckless gang that campaigned for Brexit. You know, this June, in fact, is the 10th anniversary anniversary of the fateful vote for Brexit. Not that the European Union was any paradise, but to suddenly cut off all your economic relations with it's an act of complete, you know, what's the word for it? Complete irresponsibility. I mean, but that's what they did. Why? Because it's not like they cared about what happened to ordinary British people. What the only thing Boris Johnson cared about was getting to number 10. And he could see very early on that this was the shortest route to number 10 ran through Brexit. And he was right. It was indeed his shortest route to number 10. He got there. But of course, he couldn't last there because that's the whole problem. Populism can only be extremely volatile and unstable. Why? Because in order to get to power, populism must promise people the earth. But in order to stay in power and in order to do what they have come to power to do, which is serve capitalist interests, they must violate every promise. So both across the political spectrum, all the major parties we have today are committed to serving the same corporate capitalist interest. And the more they serve these corporate capitalist interests, the faster they are falling from power. So Britain has gone through 6 prime ministers in 10 years. And who knows how long Andy Burnham is going to last, provided he becomes prime minister. So all of this tells you, look at across the pond. I mean, Trump, within within 6 months of becoming president, he faced falling polling numbers. Right. And to me, by the way, this is the other part of the war in Iran, is that the war in Iran is a symptom of the decline of imperialism and the decline of the West in this sense also, because Trump would never have undertaken the war on Iran had he not been in such a tight squeeze as he is right now. But that's another story altogether. So I've kind of deviated a little bit. But to come back to the point of ideology, let me say one final thing. Basically, we live in a world in which the only way ahead, as far as the bulk of the people are concerned, ordinary people are concerned, is through some kind of socialism. But unfortunately, what we have are all the organized political forces that are currently present across in most parts of the world, barring China, of course, which is ruled by a Communist Party, or for that matter, North Korea, and what have you, barring these socialist countries, the only political forces that exist are those that will, in one form or another, serve the corporate capitalist interest, and they can only drive everybody into the ground. So the one simple way in which I feel that it doesn't matter if you are ideological or not is that, people like Modi and Bolsonaro and Boris Johnson and what have you can come to power, but they can't stay in power very long. People forget that Modi lost his majority in the last election. People forget, and of course now there is a groundswell of opposition to him in a variety of ways. Bolsonaro is no longer in power. Trump is very unpopular. Johnson had to leave. So ultimately, you can try every which way, but the only way that will succeed is in a broadly socialist direction. And that is just historical necessity. Capitalism has very little to offer to ordinary people today. And so if we are being non-ideological rather, it means that we are willing to try anything, which if that includes socialism, go for it. That's and the point of socialism as an ideology is simply to shorten the birth pangs. Ultimately nothing will succeed but some kind of socialism. But if we knew that, then we would not try every other way, and we would go, we would take the shortcut to socialism.
Yeah, talking about the shortcut, I'm also curious about shortcuts to socialism because, in the long run, as someone said, I know who said that we are all dead, but the decline of socialism, among many other things, the fall of the Soviet Union being very, very primary or very, very important. The other thing was the triumph of global finance. I mean, it really, really defeated class struggle and strengthened class forces, and it was and all that informalization of labor, everything had to, the structural adjustment programs, imposition, and So I wanted to ask you about the finance or the state of affairs with global finance itself, because on one hand we've been talking about the decline of the global financial sphere as trillions of dollars were sloshing around, having to find areas to invest productively, not being unable to do that. Lots of stock buybacks because there are not new areas. I mean, it did seem for a while that it was suffocated, and now the financial press is saying, oh, the public stocks are coming back. The age of dirt of stocks is over because now the fat giant AI needs so much of resources that they would have to pull it from the public, and so there are more stocks being listed now. I mean, there are lots and lots of materials in the Bloomberg and the Financial Times about this, and so that there seems to be some kind of a shift in my reading that is going on within the financial sphere, and even at the level of countries. If you look at the Asian market, it has been quite interesting. I mean, South Korea, Taiwan, parts of China who have taken the AI lead. They are seeing a lot of capital inflows, and that is reflected in the overall buoyancy of the Asian markets. While Indonesia, India, the Philippines, I mean, the currencies are under tremendous pressure. The part of that is the oil price because of the the current account deficits and its pressure. But part of that was simply capital flowing out of their markets, domestic markets. And so, in some ways, if you are not fighting that battle for AI and the high sphere of technology, then you are losing out. In other ways, its impact on the social sphere is tremendous. I mean, there is tremendous resentment within Samsung about how the salaries of the top tiers have gone up while the others have been hollowed out, and its impact on employment. I was on the phone with Professor Prabhat Patnaik, and we were discussing about the impact of AI on employment, particularly in our part of the world where there has been underemployment historically. So I'm really, really curious to hear your thoughts about global finance and its role in class war and class struggle, and do you see hopes that socialism can emerge as a process of struggling against a global financial system that has been imperialistic, non-inclusive, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, so again, let me say that there is no such thing as a global financial system. I think you have to, whenever you talk about capital flows, and I have no doubt that there is a lot of international capital flows. So I'm not doubting that at all. I just don't want to call them global because it makes you think that, okay, it's kind of uniform all over the world. It involves the whole world more or less equally. It does not. So basically, what we have is an over inflated financial system which is centered on the dollar. And that is really the key, if you ask me, of the key destabilizer. A little while back, I gave a speech at the Valdai Club in Sochi, in Russia, in which I said that the dollar system is the biggest inequality generating machine in the world, and it does so through a number of ways. But before I get, I mean, I'm not going to enumerate them, but obviously, first of all, it does not invest productively, and so any employment effects are absent. It is able to modify tax laws and so on in such a way that income from capital is taxed less and less, while income from work is taxed more and more. All of these sorts of things are going on. It is the home of capital flows, which are always pro-cyclical. So third world countries only get finance in a pro-cyclical fashion when they don't need it, and when they most need it, they don't get it. That's not counter-cyclical, etc. So there are many, many different ways. But this to me is the issue, and I have argued that since 1971, since the dollar was no longer linked to gold, and this entire period, which a lot of people say, look at, isn't the dollar great? It has remained the world's money, even though it broke the link with gold, blah, blah. Isn't it like fantastic and so on? No, basically the dollar has remained the world's currency in this period. After that, only by inflating a series of bubbles of financial activity since that time. And this is particularly apparent now, and particularly became very clear with the dot-com bubble, and then the housing and credit bubbles, and today the everything bubble. So what this does is it keeps money from the rest of the world flowing into the system, putting up updraft, giving an updraft to the value of the dollar, which would otherwise sink given the size of the deficits and so on. So this larger financial flows have done that. Now, this happened to coincide with the onset of neoliberalism, the productive decline of Western capitalism, which means that there is less and less productive investment. There is more and more money sloshing around the system, which is not productively invested, but nevertheless is seeking a return. So there's more and more money competing for returns. And in this context, then two things particularly help. Number one, size helps. The more money you have to throw into any wager, given that the margins can often be really tiny, the more money you have to throw in, the more money you can make. And of course, the other part is the easy money policies, which have been followed with a few interruptions here and there by the Federal Reserve, and then in emulation of that, other central banks. Since 2000, since the bursting of the dot-com bubble. At that time, they brought interest rates down to about 1%, where they stayed until about 2005, 2006, when they had to be raised little by little, because there was downward pressure on the dollar, even with all this money coming into the bubbles that were being inflated by the Federal Reserve at that time. And then once they reached about 5.5%, the housing and credit bubbles burst. And then in the aftermath of that, all sorts of holy pious statements were made about how we must never do this again, and we must re-regulate, etc. And there was a big Frank Dodd bill and what have you. But in fact, we are back in bubble territory with even more astronomical amounts of money sloshing around the system. Now, in this context, you were asking about AI and so on. In this context, basically, what has happened is that a small number of whatever you want to call them, CEOs, corporations, whatever, they have started making absurd science fiction-like promises. Elon Musk is going to take ordinary people to Mars. Google and ChatGPT and whatever, they are going to create artificial general intelligence, artificial super intelligence. All of these are pies in the sky. They are not realizable. The reason for China's success at AI, AI is nothing but advanced computing power. And China has been very sensible, and it has applied it to discrete and defined projects where it can work, it can succeed, etc. It does not pretend to replace artificial general intelligence. We were chatting, earlier before we started this show, that to me, I find it so, everybody is afraid of the employment effects of this and so on. And undoubtedly, there will be some employment effects. But the idea that AI is going to eliminate intellectual labor is a little absurd, for the simple reason that automation and more primitive forms of elimination, productivity increases, have not eliminated manual labor from the system. Instead, you have contracting out, which means you shift production to lower wage areas, or you bring in immigrants to do the work, the hard work that nobody else wants to do, and which the immigrants will do on, cheap wages and bad working conditions and so on. And this is the way in which capitalism has resolved this problem. There is no way they're going to replace intellectual labor. But But, and this is where you have what they will actually deliver in the name of, eliminating intellectual labor are essentially chatbots and other such things where, even under Rishi Sunak, we were being told that, the government is going to economize by replacing all sorts of government employees with these chatbots and so on. Well, so you and I, when we want to contact a big corporation or government or whatever, we'll be sitting there talking with this asinine chatbot, which will not be able to serve us. But the government will say, well, you see, we have our lines are open, call us anytime. Well, this is just going to lead to increased frustration because none of these chatbots are going to work. Okay. So basically, we have capital that is encouraging us, on the one hand, to invest in things that it cannot realize. So, you were saying that, everybody's celebrating the reversal of the trend towards private equity and the increasing number of IPOs, the creating the opportunity for ordinary people to own shares again, etc. Rubbish. The trend towards private equity was already appropriating all the assets of value away from ordinary people and into private pockets and hands, with companies that no longer have to publicize their results. What is that document that is published every year? Give annual reports and so on. They don't have to do that because they are now privately owned. And when the public is being offered a chance to invest in in shares, it's the public is being offered what the Americans like to call a pig in a poke. You don't know what kind of pig it is because it's in a poke, which means it's a bag. You can't see the pig. So that's what they are being offered. There is very little to celebrate here. I would say that one final point, I would say that all of this is heading towards a crisis. I don't know if you saw, but in today's news, we already saw that SpaceX, after reaching, these IPOs that are being offered and that took the stock market to new heights. Well, SpaceX this morning or whatever, recently, has closed with a market capitalization of 2.03 trillion, down from an intraday peak of 3 trillion. So in less than a day, it has lost a third of its value. What kind of value are we talking about? Why should anybody invest? There is nothing real here. If the value of something can fluctuate between 100 and 66, should I be investing in it? I don't think so.
Yeah, I think the part of science fiction and this kind of mythical stories have always been part of finance. I mean, crazy stories have to be told in order to drive a madness. Of course, these stories are different in different age, but there are those stories about in the 1990s about 401k and how if they would pour in their 401k into this newly deregulated market in the US, they can realize, all kinds of things that were crazy, but what it did, those were never realized, but what was done was enormous amount of money being unlocked for finance to gain power collectively. So I think these are.
May I come back on that? I think this is a very important point you're making, and I really feel it is important for us. I mean, what you're saying is said by not only many people, but a lot of extremely influential economists have said that. But it is very, very important to poke a couple of holes in this because this is exactly the wrong way to do things. So, firstly, and I want to talk about in particular two sorts of things. Number one, this idea, which was particularly popularized by Charles Kindleberger in his book Manias, Panics, and Crashes, that basically what he was arguing, he told a very this guy is very erudite. Don't get me wrong, but erudition does not necessarily mean that your conclusions are always correct. You know a lot of things, but are you drawing the right lessons. So Charles Kindleberger, who, by the way, I should say, is one of the most important intellectuals behind the notion that the dollar will rule and will always rule, etc. Charles Kindleberger was, and you have to understand him as an American figure who circulated in the top policy making echelons. So he always took the point of view of the United States. Okay, that's the key thing you have to remember, which is not always the point of view of humanity. In this book, Manias, Crashes, Panics, Manias, Panics, and Crashes, he basically says, look, there's nothing anybody can do about finance. Finance will always be like that. It's always been like that. Look at the tulip mania, look at the peppercorn mania, look at the South Sea bubble, look at all of these things. And so, we just have to stop worrying and learn to love manias, panics, and crashes. Sorry, Charles, that's not true. In the entire period between the end of the Second World War and the beginnings of financial deregulation circa 1980, there were hardly any financial crashes, even though the world during this time experienced the most robust growth period ever. Okay, it was a period of financial repression. It was a period during which finance was harnessed. Finance was harnessed for productive growth. It is time we harnessed finance again, rather than having finance harness us for its own bubble-driven, debt-driven growth, because that's what finance does. Finance skims off any income that comes from work, whether it is profits of productive corporations, revenues of decent governments, or public service providing governments, or wages of ordinary workers. They skim off the top of this, and that's how finance lives. And then all of this goes into speculative bubbles. There is absolutely no need for anyone in the world to have such a financial system, except the tiny minority that benefits from them. So I think we have to park this idea that somehow financial bubbles are part of economic life. They are not. They can be excluded from our economic life, and finance can be harnessed for human development rather than human development being harnessed to finance. And the second thing is this idea that somehow, without telling some pie in the sky stories, you can't get people to invest. No, again, during this period of the greatest productive investment and high investment rates and so on, you didn't have that. You don't have these pie in the sky stories in China. You have productive development there. We had productive development in various parts of the world in the post-Second World War period. So for all of these reasons, this idea that somehow some level of mania is functional to productive investment, this is completely wrong. Yes, this is exactly what happened in the dot-com bubble. This is exactly what's going to happen now. There's going to be a huge crash, but that it doesn't have to be this way. We do not have to have this kind of and by the way, I should also say one other thing. This idea, yes, there is this slight bit of overinvestment. I mean, that's a function of capitalism. There were overinvestment in railways or what have you. But on the whole, the kind of overinvestment we saw at the result of the misdirected overinvestment we saw with the dot-com bubble, and we are now seeing with this crazy idea about let's invest in data centers and they are somehow going to produce artificial general intelligence. It's no more credible than the idea that you give, a million monkeys typewriters and eventually they'll produce Shakespeare. Come on, this is ridiculous.
Yeah, true. I think financiers have always had this tendency. I mean, people who, not those who invest, but those who try to pull investments from relatively large swaths of land, and but they do need to tell stories that are convincing. Now I agree that these stories don't necessarily have to be fairy tales. I mean, they can be stories that are reasonable, but yeah, history of finance does say that there seems to be a general tendency to inflate the positive sides to draw more investments. And this is true about the plantation economy, how finance was raised at point in time. Stories about Africa being told, about mines from Latin America, the Carorico mines and silver. I mean, if you read the history of business history of people who were involved, I mean, the kind of stories they used to tell in the metropolis where they raised were actually fairy tale stories. So there seems to be a tendency within big pool of finance to tell stories that are that are fairy. Now China, of course, is different because China doesn't operate within the logic of finance capitalism. There is a state party that keep strict control. I mean, one can talk about speculation in Chinese real estate when the real estate was liberalized, and people did talk about owning 3 or 4 or 5 homes as means to multiply their wealth more rapidly. I mean, I Chinese friends, so do you, and we know these stories, but these are at different levels than the kind of stories about plantation or railway in the United States, or the kind of bubbles that we are talking about. But yeah, I think the basic lessons should be more important, as you said. I mean, the history should not be give us a fatalistic lesson saying that because the financial sphere has been so speculative. I mean, you have made a distinction that these speculations can be different, but even if there needs to be some levels of speculation, we shouldn't be fatalistic and say that, oh, we should throw up our hands and say that we can't do anything. We should stabilize them and we should gear them to work more towards our people. And that's, I think, part of people who talk about sustainable finance. The I was curious to hear your thoughts about globalization, because the US Iran war does raise a lot of questions on globalization, because what experts are saying that part of the military success that Iran had was because it was not dependent on others. It was even if it didn't have air force, even it didn't have big navy, whatever it had, it built a capacity domestically to harness and to build. And so when the crunch moment came, there were no shortages of supply the way it would have happened if they had relied on Russia or China or whoever else. So it does bring to my mind these bigger questions about national sovereignty, or autonomous economic sphere, as opposed to globalization, and so on and so forth. So that's the first set of development. Prior to that was the tariff wars, which sort of exposed the vulnerabilities of relying on not just global finance but global trade. And in India itself, which where elites have been relying on US jobs, US stocks, US institutional finance money coming in the stock market and inflating the stock market, and you investing there and making money and all kinds of things. Even they had to have these doubts. And finally, the whole digital sphere, that war, if Strait of Hormuz was leveraged by Iran, China really leveraged the rare earths. I mean, of course, China had different other cards, but the rare earths are very, 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 very critical to it. And so, people are raising questions even within India who are not necessarily from the left, or those group of people who have spoken out against globalization, but they have been raising questions about relying on giant multinational corporations giving up, everything in the internet sphere to private corporations, not having alternative to, global digital spaces, and so on and so forth. So my question to you, Professor Desai, is in this moment where people are talking about national sovereignty, where people are raising questions about globalization, whether it is coming from Africa due to the wreckage of the structural adjustment programs, or whether it is coming from India because of the blackmailing that they have seen through H1B, or pulling out of FAIIs because of these trade deals. What should the left do? What kind of clarity should the left provide? And what is the left in all this struggle?
Yeah. I mean, before I come to the question of globalization and then the question of what the left should do, let me just say a couple of things about the points you were making a bit before you pose those questions. Number one, there are two very distinct models of finance. If a lot of people say, oh, we must all read Hilferding because, he wrote about finance capital back in 1911 and, whatever, 1910. And it will tell us a lot about today, what's happening today. Nothing doing. What Hilferding called finance capital was the polar opposite of the kind of financial system we have today. What Hilferding called finance capital was a financial system geared toward expanding productive activity, paradigmatically as observed by him in Germany. Although he also said that the American system was pretty similar. But he contrasted both of these systems with the British system, which was precisely of this speculative kind, etc. So it was capable, it was prone to speculation. It was short-termist rather than geared for long-term investment. It took no particular responsibility for the long-term future and development of the enterprise, whereas the German system did, was very much invested in the long-term development of capital. So these are two distinct models of finance. Today also, and so he contrasted them at that time, and I have talked to so many people who've written theses on Hilferding without noticing that Hilferding contrasts this. He does it in plain language. He contrasts these two models. They didn't notice
Even
it. So
even Keynes was very much against speculative finance. I mean, he had very
absolutely,
strong word to say in the general theory
yes.
about this.
And in fact, I mean, and I should say, since you bring up Keynes, that indeed he was very clear that you needed a financial system that was geared towards productive expansion. And remember also that sometimes I think that the one thing that one should remember about Keynes is that his entire career, his intellectual career, spanned what I call the 30 Years crisis. He wrote his first book, which was in Indian Currency and Finance, which we can discuss, in 1913. And by 1946, he was gone, partly destroyed by the difficulty of the negotiations that he had to conduct with the Americans for a loan for the British. But anyway, forget that. But you see, so that this was a very difficult time for the UK. And in this period, you could practically observe the decline of Britain. And Keynes also sat on two industrial commissions in this period, so he could see that British industry was ill-served by her financial system. And the second thing I want to say about Keynes is that if you actually look at the proposals he went to Bretton Woods with for Bancor, for an international clearing union, etc., they were precisely designed to at least create the possibility that a responsible government would take the opportunities offered by the particular architecture of the system to drive forward productive growth and also relatively egalitarian growth, because he also believed that relatively egalitarian growth would create the demand stimulus that was necessary for sustained development in any country, etc. But anyway, since you mentioned Keynes, I point this out, and totally, I completely agree with you that Keynes understood very well that there were two very different models of finance. One was desirable, the other was absolutely anathema. So that's one thing. Secondly, if you look at China, yes, China had a real estate bubble, but the key lies in how it was dealt with. In the West, the bubbles were encouraged by those responsible for restraining them. In China, the government actually, once it was realized that there is a bubble, the government actually pricked the bubble, did not continue to inflate it, but pricked it and then handled the consequences of it in a way that that was good for ordinary people, including ordinary homeowners. They did not, jingle mail was not part of that narrative, where people gave up their homes and so on. So China has dealt with its property bubble, and yes, it has to some extent a market economy, and this was a result of that. Fine. But once it was realized that there's a bubble, China dealt with it in an absolute opposite way from the way in which it was dealt with in the in the US. Now, let's look at the question of globalization. So I've been telling you I'm allergic to this and I'm allergic to that. So here's another thing I'm allergic to is the very notion of globalization. I think there is no such thing. I used to go around saying that, folks, there is no such thing as globalization. There are still national economies, and there are. And I'll give you a very small example of that. If you think globalization was real, Canada should have been devastated by 2008, but it was not. Because very few Canadian financial institutions had actually participated in in buying these toxic securities generated in the United States. Go figure. Why did they not? Where does that leave globalization? Canada sits right next to the United States. You'd think that Canada has, but no, there are national economies. No matter, even though Canada does 70% of its trade with the United States, even then Canada was not affected. And this, given that even if people concede that, production may not be globalized, and of course, labor flows are anything but globalized, people would say that, yeah, finance is globalized. But here's a limitation. Canada was not financially connected with the US in this way. So globalization has always been exaggerated. Like I say, I used to say that it is wrong, but now I say, it still remains wrong, and I'll say it if it's necessary. But now I say, my headline is, don't use the term globalization because it addles your mind. It makes you think you know something when in fact you know nothing. For example, if you want to talk about, international production, you shouldn't, if you use the word globalization, you think everybody is equally involved in production everywhere. No. The internationalization of production has taken particular highways and byways, and it's important to trace what those were. They are very specific. They have to do with a certain amount of FDI, but actually a lot more outsourcing. They went from some countries to some other countries. It was not global, etc. And including in the case of finance. So, for example, today, it's not just the Iran war. There never was globalization. What was globalization was really, it was a term that really became very fashionable under the Clinton administration because people like Robert Reich and Stiglitz were using it, particularly Stiglitz. Before he became a great critic of globalization, he was actually head of the Council of Economic Affairs, promoting globalization as a good thing, in particular, the lifting of capital controls. This was a part of the Clinton administration project to get particularly the big emerging markets to lift capital controls in order that they were told that if you lift capital controls, your growing economies will get the capital they need, productive capital, etc. And of course, all that did was it created the East Asian financial crisis. So there you go. But that it was really more a rhetoric. It was a way of trying to get more and more countries to open up their capital accounts so that more of their money could flow into the US-centered financial system, which is also the basis for the dollar, etc. So to me, globalization was never right. In contrast, what is true? Well, I would say that political economists going back to Alexander Hamilton, Friedrich List, and by the way, I've also shown that Marx understood all these things very well. The best way to industrialize, to advance, is to have national industrial policy, a national industrialization program, which may include tariffs and protection, but they have to be geared towards essentially industrializing your country. Without that, you will never get industrialization. This plan may fail. It has failed lots of times. You can devise the wrong industrial policies, but without some industrial policy, there will be no success. So the only reaction to failure you are permitted to have if you're really serious about development is try again, try a better policy, but not give up on it with this vague idea that somehow if you open up your domestic markets and open up your international markets, that somehow development will come like some kind of fairy godmother. Development does not come like that. Development comes only by essentially protecting yourself against infant industry protection, etc. Well calibrated policies. And this has been known since the days of List and Hamilton through to today's developmental state theorists. And everyone in between, people like Prabhat would agree with this completely. And for that, today, the biggest need is capital controls. And by the way, I should say that, in fashionable company, in the company that very rich people keep, including influential economists who also happen to rub shoulders with very rich people, to even mention capital controls is like you will be shunned. It's like saying a bad word. Like nobody will talk to you. Everybody in the party will go away from where you're standing to some other corner of the room, because that is the one thing you're not allowed to say. But without controlling finance, you're not going to get development, because that capital controls are the first thing you need when you want to shift from the bad model of finance to a good model of finance.
Yeah, it's a huge topic. I'm aware your time is. We should bring this to an end. I'm still curious. How would you explain the change that happened in the 90s and 2000s, if not the word globalization? And I'm also not sure if the argument that globalization was not, because globalization was not uniform, because the way European banks participated in that transatlantic financial system, because the way European banks participated in the repo market and the security market and the housing market in the US, because the way they did, the Canadian banks didn't do, is whether there is a strong enough argument in itself to say that there was not something that was happening both in financial and trade sphere across the globe, however uneven that was. I mean, if you look at the tariff rates on the current account itself, tariff rates came down dramatically. That wouldn't have happened without very, very deliberate efforts at the level of the WTO. And I'm tracing the politics that happened, played out in the WTO. I mean, different baskets, all these objections being raised by countries from the third world, as you say. And yes, there are these uneven stories, but the way economies opened up, and some of those were maybe captured as regional. I mean, in East Asia, something remarkable happened. I mean, if you actually look at the kind of FDI that China was receiving from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, from Singapore, from Japan, from South Korea, that is a spectacular story, as spectacular as it might be compared to some of those joint stock companies that China formed with parts of the West. But I'm curious, how would you describe that massive phenomenon, if not globalization?
Okay, so first of all, let me say that I mean, there's so much I could say. So let me try to summarize it in a few points. So your question is, why did globalization happen? And you're saying it was a massive phenomenon, but I think that
No, I'm saying, how do you describe that? I mean, I take your objection that globalization, it has its downsides, because it might give us an impression that it was even everywhere, or it can also make nations and local economy and all those things completely irrelevant. I mean, it might give that impression, although when I use the word globalization, I don't mean that. I mean a rise of institutions that started operating at a transnational level, whose impact on our economic life was enormous, and the way it was not before that. But my question to you is, how do you describe the change?
right. So there are a number of ways to describe that change. Okay, so first of all, it is just a new stage in neoliberalism. So beginning circa 1980, 1979, 1980, you begin to get governments in power in different countries, advanced countries in the world, beginning with the UK, then going on to the US, of governments committed to implementing free market, free trade policies as the alleged solution to the deep crisis in which Western economies found themselves. We were told that state bad, market good, etc. By the end of that decade, already this vision was in trouble. And a new discourse was needed. And so you got the discourse of globalization. The discourse of globalization was that, it's a juggernaut. It's coming, whether we like it or not. So, by the way, I should tell you, I don't argue just that globalization had a downside. Of course, it had many downsides, but that is not my argument. I was once part of a panel in which one person argued that globalization is fantastic. Another person argued that it is terrible. It's exacting a huge cost on people. A third person argued, look, folks, there's no point, do not weep, do not praise. Globalization is a reality. It's a juggernaut. You can't stop it. It's happening. And I argue that there is no such thing as I argue, that globalization is finished. And what did I mean by that? Not that there was something real called globalization, but that the Clinton administration that was most in favor of promoting the idea of globalization was by that time out of office. We had now a Bush Jr. administration that was allergic to the term globalization. They preferred the term empire. Different story, but nevertheless, they did not like the term globalization. That's the first thing. The second thing I'd like to say is that my example of Canada was just an example. I can show you in a multitude of different ways. Everybody thought globalization was about jobs going south. If globalization was about jobs going to ever cheaper locations, FDI going to ever cheaper locations, Bangladesh and other poor countries should have been flooded with FDI. They were not. China was. Yes, I agree with you, China was. And in fact, a large part of that story actually has to do with China, which is why in China, the term globalization is actually rather popular because they feel there's a subjective feeling that because China prospered during the decade during which the term globalization was like a buzzword, you couldn't think for it. It was just everybody and their dog was talking about it. So then, globalization was good for China. But actually, China prospered precisely because it did not do what Western globalization rhetoric demanded countries should do, which is open up their markets, reduce tariffs, blah, blah, etc. China managed every front of its connection with the rest of the world economy and did so rather well. So that's the second thing I'd say is that, the third thing I'd say is that actually, if you look at statistics about the international trade as a proportion of GDP for different parts of the world, the one part of the world that globalized the most, everybody else was already they were the one part of the world that globalized the most was the United States. It went from having world trade being like 10% of GDP to being 20-25%. I forget the exact figure, but you can look it up. And so this was the period during which exactly, you say, how do you explain this? Part of the function of neoliberalism was to make it easier for big corporations in the United States to engage in FDI and more generally, import things from abroad and so on. And in fact, funnily enough, there is also, I have another beef with the term globalization because people talk about the globalization of production. And you'd think that that refers to a vast expansion of FDI, but actually FDI has not expanded that much. What has expanded is outsourcing. That is to say, where, say, Walmart engages a company which is owned and operated by, say, an Indonesian person or corporation to produce, I don't know, shoes or slippers or whatever of a certain size, quality, and so on. Now, this is not an ownership relationship. It's a market relationship. Same thing happened in China as well, although China did get much more FDI, but even in China, there was a lot more outsourcing. And this allowed, in the case of China, with a proper developmental state behind these firms, whether they were engaged, they were FDI firms or outsourcing firms, they were able to go up the value chain. And particularly where there is a market relationship, these firms can go up the value chain, expand their own buyers, expand the circle of their buyers to others, and so on. So all of this was happening, but lumping together outsourcing and FDI is a sleight of hand, because truly, if production was global, it should be FDI, but FDI did not happen to the same extent, partly because by this time, big monopoly capitalism had already become senile. It did not have that sort of vigor to expand in the same way, and so on. So it preferred to outsource. But anyway, so to come back to my main story, this was basically the decade during which US capital in particular took to outsourcing and FDI, and to much greater extent outsourcing. And that has continued in the period since, but of course they got some rude shocks. With China, of course, coming up, and then the pandemic showing that supply chains could be so fragile, etc. And now, of course, with the Iran war and the whole Strait of Hormuz situation. But remember also in the previous year, China also was able to China has its own Strait of Hormuz in the sense that it has control over these rare earths or whatever, these critical minerals that China processes rather than necessarily just mines. But so there are that's the nature of the world economy. I have somewhere in storage right now, but I have an amazing map of India, which was produced in the early part of the 19th century. It was a colonial map, obviously. India was a colony at that time. And in the map, it gives you like a list of all the things that can be found in different parts of India. So here there are cattle, here there are sheep, here there is iron, here there is copper, here there is wheat, here there is rice, etc. And that's just the way geography is. Geography is not even. Not everybody produces everything. So anyway, I'm perhaps going on a bit, but to me, globalization was always a rhetoric of the Clinton administration. Oh, and one final point. The term globalization itself is a way of not talking about imperialism. Let me tell you what I mean by that. When the rhetoric of globalization began to become big, Anthony Giddens was a great guru of globalization and so on. And people like David Held and others were particularly in the forefront of, popularizing the use of the term. They first, made extraordinary claims, which were, of course, countered by skeptics who said, what are you talking about? These things that you are saying is not true. National economies are not, have not become irrelevant. Government economic policy still matters. Production is not global. Bulk of investment is still domestic. 80% or more of the investment is domestic in most parts of the world. It's like world average is actually higher than 80%. So what are you talking about? Whatever. So there was a big pushback. So then they said, oh, well, we are not hyper globalist and we are not skeptics. We are somewhere in the nice little muddly middle, etc. They started saying stuff like that. But you see, and so we are transformationalists. The world is slowly becoming globalist, etc., etc. But in reality, and then they also manufactured this rhetoric about how there had been a first wave of globalization, which culminated in 1914. Like, hello, I don't call that globalization. That was the phase of imperialism, And so there was a first wave of globalization. Now we have a second wave of globalization. Rubbish. The world is not global. The world is composed of an international hierarchy, which has hitherto been maintained by imperialism, capitalist imperialism, of countries at the top, which are able to essentially extract more from the rest of the world. But that is changing. thanks to the development of socialist countries in particular, and more generally, the resistance of countries to being dominated and peoples to being dominated. And there is only one direction to go from here. So we will have a world of nation states, a world of you asked also about what the left should do. I think the left must rehabilitate what in one of my research projects called developmental nationalism. We are told nationalism is bad, and obviously the kind of nationalism Modi represents is absolutely abhorrent. But there is a progressive nationalism, a nationalism that says we can do it. We are going to give ourselves a better life. We are going to give the least of us a better life. And we are going to progress by implementing national economic policies. That does not mean making an enemy out of other countries. We are going to have relations of mutual benefit with other countries. All of this was part of the rhetoric of development in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, and was only reversed by neoliberalism.
Very shortly, do you think it will be different from that post the phase of decolonization, after the Second World War, the kind of national economies that were constituted, heavy restrictions on capital movement across the boundaries, and even there were domestic restrictions as well. Higher tariffs to protect national industries and industries that were important strategically or in terms of employment generation, etc., etc. There were many arguments. Would there be something new in this new phase? I mean, are there things that strike you that would be new? Some people say that, we might be now better off taking an element or two here and there from that phase of neoliberalism, the way China used that moment of globalization to export. I mean, if those areas can be opened out for specific economies, those can be taken, but areas of vulnerability should be guarded against. I mean, in what ways would it be different, or is it the same? If you were at the policy making, would you say it's the same as it was in the 60s, 70s, 80s, or would you say it is very different, even if I'm arguing against opening up?
Right. So let me be a bit pugnacious and say it will be the same. But of course, let me also add that you never cross the same river twice, you see. I mean, that's the time goes on. History never repeats itself. But it does rhyme, as Mark Twain once said. So I would say that, like I was saying earlier, the response to the failure of these development models is not to give them up. It is to improve upon them. So I would say that something very similar is necessary. Certainly, capital controls would be necessary. Certainly, an enormous state role in creating, particularly at a time when big corporations show no appetite to invest productively unless they are guaranteed obscenely high profits, which is what the function of state has turned out to be. Today, all the fashionable talk about industrial policy simply amounts to this: that the state should give great lucrative contracts, guaranteed profit contracts to private corporations, and that's being relabeled industrial policy. Well, in the old days, industrial policy was never about that. And so that's another, way in which neoliberalism, which has never been about competition or free markets and always been about promoting the interests of big monopoly corporations, and not even of small capital, medium capital, etc. Not even that. So that's one thing I would say. Secondly, I would say that China. Yes, I mean, to some extent, I think China did benefit from this alleged globalization, largely because American corporations saw that as a big opportunity and so on. But I would say two things. Number one, even when it was happening, in the late 90s and early 2000s, when China was exporting more than it is exporting now, because exports as a share of GDP has gone down in China. What's the point of doing this? So here you say, here, It's what is the point of saying, here, have my goods, but here, have my money to buy my goods? Like, what's the point? China is a developing country. China needs to increase the consumption of people of China. China needs to continue to maintain a high level of growth by investing in China, which is, and that is what, by the way, China has. So except for a period between roughly 1995, and you know more about this, Jyotishman, than I do because you study China more closely, but except for a period between 95 and 2005, when it seemed as if there was, certainly China seemed to be in a kind of particularly neoliberal phase of growth, I think China has now returned to its broader socialist principles, where in order to maintain legitimacy, China needs to continue to deliver a decent life to people, which now includes certain environmental concerns and so on. But anyway, and I think that can only be achieved. Not, this export-oriented model was never a good one. And also, remember, no export-oriented model, insofar as it was ever successful, whether we are talking about China or South Korea or Taiwan or Japan, no such model has ever succeeded without a prior period of import substituting industrialization. Domestically focused import substituting industrialization. So you have to create a broad industrial base first. And then for the rest, I mean, look, if you are thinking on a planetary scale rather than some individual country, some individual country, especially if it's small, can get away, by developing through export surpluses. But what is the point at the end of the day of an export-oriented model in which your model does not rely on expanding the consuming capacity and the income of your own people? That should be the purpose of development. I often joke to my students, I said, you are told by neoliberals that the way in which to develop is to, keep your wages low. No, the whole purpose of development is to increase the wages of your people. Otherwise, why bother? What are you doing? You are selling exploitation in the name of development. Yeah. So if you are really serious, like if you're a finance minister or an industry minister or whatever, who is committed to improving lives of ordinary people in your country, it will be a no-brainer. You will not undertake practically any of the policies recommended by neoliberalism. And China, by the way, China may have opened up domestically a market economy, but China has never stopped planning the overall economy. And I think that's the key, really. I mean, within that, you can do it in various ways. You can give free markets greater control. You can have a better system of command and control planning. I don't care how you do it. I mean, in that sense, Deng was right. It doesn't matter whether it's a black cat or a white cat, so long as it catches mice. But here, the mouse to catch is the welfare of ordinary people. And in no neoliberal country has the welfare of people improved. And I don't consider China a neoliberal country.
Agree. I think proponents of export driven economy, and I'm against it. I mean, I would say that more than suppressing your wage in your own country to be competitive in the international market, I think more than that is the problem of how you are in exporting deflation in other countries where whose employments you are taking away because their productive capacity is stopped by increasing your productivity. So I think as much as I'm focused on China because of the mind-boggling transformation that they did within this period, my politics is more rooted in that of the third world, as you like, and I used to say global south, because it is there where most of the development should come, and that there is often a negative relationship between export-led development at one place vis-a-vis others, because I've seen that how industries get erased when you import too many goods. So I think that's an objection too. And just to end on a final note, I once interviewed an environmentalist, and we were discussing about the need to reduce consumption. And I of course, I was focused on what that means for the rest of the global south, where there is an urgent need to drive up consumption, and what does responsibility and all these things mean. And he said that even computers are highly polluting, and he was right at the global level. And I had the fun question of saying that I like to play chess online, and in your world, would I still be able to play chess? And I wanted to ask you, given you said that we should return to an age of heavy capital control, are you worried, as I was worried about playing chess online when I was talking or discussing the need to drive down the production of electronics and so on? Are you worried about you not being able to travel from Canada to the UK in an age of heavy export control? Because, as you would know, Milton Friedman, and I'm not saying that it was a good book, but his book, Market as Freedom or something, Freedom, I think it was named just Freedom. He opens the book by saying, I mean, it's a silly way to do that, but he opens by, because he knew where the public sentiment lies. He says that it is ridiculous that Americans have dollars, but they can't travel to France because somehow, under the repressive currency regime, they would not be able to access France's currency. And that's how he opens. I mean, maybe it was not France, but some European country. So to be a little bit provocative and maybe even silly at certain level, in that age of heavy capital control, would you be bothered by having to stay in Canada?
So there's a wonderful Keynes quote. He says, I sympathize, therefore, with those who would minimize rather than those who would maximize economic entanglement among nations. Ideas, knowledge, science, hospitality, travel, these are the things that should be of their nature international. But let goods be homespun wherever it is reasonably and conveniently possible. And above all, let finance be primarily national. I would largely agree with this. And you have to understand that, yes, of course, today I live a life in which I travel too much across borders. But I'm also painfully aware that I can do this because I'm no longer on an Indian passport. This idea that, some of us can travel and that's fantastic. Well, most of the world cannot travel in the way that I do. And so I'm acutely aware that that's a privilege. And also remember that I spent the first not only did I spend the first 20 years of my life in India, but I never gave up my Indian citizenship until they came up with this, what at that time was called a PIO card, so that I could always reclaim my Indian citizenship if I ever wanted. I now have an OCI card. But anyway, the point is that up until the late 90s, actually, I did not participate in this kind of privilege of, practically visa-free travel all over the world. So that's the first thing. So most of the world cannot do it. And so it's not even something that they would miss. And our project is to improve the lives of this most of the world. And what they need primarily is an improvement in the material circumstances. Number two, if their material circumstances improved, they would get visa-free travel. But you see, Mahmoud Mamdani, the father, I should say, of Zohran Mamdani, who I knew, whose work I knew well before Zohran Mamdani became mayor. Mamdani says in the opening of one of his best books, which is called The Myth of Population Control, he says that, Paul Ehrlich starts his book Population Bomb by talking about a visit to India in which, on the way from the airport to the hotel, he sees just like these people and they were living in hovels and fires burning, and, it was sort of evoked some sort of hell in his mind. And indeed, in some ways, if you wanted to if you took a certain view, I mean, that was not a life they should have. They should have much better lives. But nevertheless, and he said there are too many people. And then Mamdani says, now, if you think about this, he would actually encounter more people on a Friday night in Times Square. But he wouldn't say the same. Why? Because it's not the quantity of people he's worried about, it's the quality. pardon me, but we're not saying that poor people are bad quality, but the point is that they are poor. If you make the world better off, then there will be greater freedoms across borders. The whole point, sometimes I think that people misunderstand the whole point of a nation state. The nation states did not exist before capitalism. They have been brought into being by capitalism precisely in order to consolidate their little advantages, in Europe as capitalist nations, and try to control as imperialist nations other nation states. And then nation states become the way of fighting back. That's why I say that there is a progressive nationalism. So we use the nation state. History has put us together, and quite frankly, it doesn't matter if you are a relatively homogeneous nation state or you are made up of different languages and cultures, etc. The fact is, history has thrown you together. So now you make the best of it, and you get out of this hole in which history has cast you by, with the most efficient means possible. That's what development is all about. Once you are developed, nobody will care whether you are here or halfway around the world, because you are not needy. Right. So that's the second thing I want to say. And finally, therefore, I think that, and I have lived in India, in as I was growing up in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, we didn't have the kind of freedoms that Indians have today. Today, when I came abroad to study in 1984, I was one of relatively few Indians who went abroad to study, and I went as a graduate student. I finished my undergraduate degree at home. These days, everybody and their dog is going to study for undergraduate studies abroad. We have a capital controls regime that is allowing people to send their kids abroad to study for undergraduate education. Foreign countries like Canada, are encouraging this because they want labor power, and this is so they dangle the carrot of a permanent residence in Canada, saying that if you come here and you study here, and then you get a job in your field, then you can stay. So a lot of people go there, but the result is massive infusion of funds into Canada's university system. On the basis of lies. I mean, I remember back, during the pandemic in particular, things were very bad because the scheme was working. The Canadian universities were getting a lot of young people from countries like India, places like Africa, and so on. And they were told that it would be very easy for them to work just 20 hours a week. They could make enough money to pay the fees and, live and study and everything. Of course, that wasn't true. And very often they were coming from relatively less well-off families, where the family had put together everything to send this one kid to school, to university. And then this kid doesn't feel able to call home and say, look, mom and dad, things are really bad here. I want to come home, because they know what the family has given them. Do you know that there are places in Ontario, in southwestern Ontario, where there are, practically every post-secondary education system was reliant at that time on foreign students. And they also had among the highest suicide rates among foreign students. This was the gory reality of this liberal capital regime, currency regime. So this is Milton Friedman's dream come true. That's all I have to say about it. I mean, I think
Right.
you'll agree, but you know what I mean, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the whole liberalization of finance also meant the banks were involved and they had to rely more on free credits, a lot of which went into the education sector, which was also liberalized at that point in time. And foreign students became, I mean, upper middle class of, foreign students became the target. They were showed these stories that they would be able to grab a great job, and part of their experience was also because of partial success of the liberalization reform in their own countries, and jobs being created in the IT sector and BPO. They thought, and all the engineering jobs and stuff. So they thought that or you can just could just go there, buy a degree, and just stay there forever. But of course, all this while production shrank in the global north as the number of graduate inflated, like never before because of the liberalization of capital. And so there was a huge crisis in terms of employment, and that led to suicide and whatnot. I mean, in many ways, like the farm suicides in Vidarbha resembles the sort of student suicides in parts of Punjab. And there was a global chain, agencies being recruited. And you travel to parts
Yes.
of Punjab, Chandigarh, you see all these
The
institutions bubbling
advertisements,
up.
the hoardings are
Yes,
everywhere. Yeah.
yes, yes,
Study
yes.
abroad hoardings are everywhere. Yeah.
Right. We'll leave it there, Professor Desai. You were so generous with your time and with your patience to explain things, and it was an honor to have you on. And thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It was a great pleasure. This conversation could go on for even longer because you have such good
Yes.
questions as well. So, yeah.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.